Hello, everyone, and welcome to the California State University Student Journalism Symposium on Covering Elections. I'm Dr. Bailing Shaw, and it is my privilege to serve as Dean of the College of Communications. Since our founding more than 30 years ago, the College of Communications at Cal State Fullerton has been deeply committed to advancing a democratic society. This commitment manifests in many ways, including our college's unwavering support for the First Amendment rights of everyone in this country. The very First Amendment, protected by the First Amendment, is freedom of religion. And so I would like to take a moment to say Shana Tova to our colleagues and students who are celebrating Rosh Hashanah this weekend. Today's event reflects most of all our commitment to the First Amendment right of freedom of the press, as you saw in our introductory video with Justina Sharp and Dr. Jason Shepard. The right to a free press is the foundational principle that undergirds and safeguards the journalism profession. Today, I am pleased to welcome as our keynote speaker, the National President of the Society of Professional Journalists, Matthew Hall. Matt is the editorial and opinion director at the San Diego Union Tribune, where he has worked since 2001. Previously, he managed the newsroom social media, was a Metro columnist, and worked as a reporter covering East and North San Diego County, as well as San Diego politics. He is a frequent speaker in high school and college classrooms, an advocate for diversity and inclusion in journalism, and a staunch supporter of the next generation of journalism professionals. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Matt Hall. Hi, Matt.
Hi, Bailing. Great to see you.
Great to see you. So while Matt is getting his slides set up, let me share that if anyone in the audience has a question, you can click on the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen. So just type in your question and then we'll have our speaker answer as many of them as possible after his presentation. So take it away, Matt.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for joining us on a Saturday morning. I appreciate, Bailing, in your introduction that you said Shana Tova to all of our Jewish friends who are not here today, but maybe watching the recording after the fact. So thank you for watching as well. I'm gonna kind of rush through these slides and tell y'all about this issue, fake news, real problem. I'm gonna give you some tips as you pursue your journalism career, both as a journalist and as a news consumer. Both of those are super important. We're increasingly seeing that trust in the media, as you'll see in a few slides, is declining, and that's a huge problem, right? Especially, I like also to say, to take a moment to remember Ruth Bader Ginsburg, whose death last night is a huge loss for a legal giant, and is also going to set off a lot of infighting in politics and a lot of long nights in journalism. And as we go forward, I'm on Twitter, SD Uncovered. Here's my email, matthew.hall@sduniontribune.com. If you have a question you don't want to ask in this group but want to ask me after, by all means, ping me in either of those mediums. So as Bailing showed here, we all know what this is. What we may not know is that coincidentally, because we're living in the era of the 45th president, there are 45 words in the First Amendment. You also may not know that it was adopted in 1791 on December 15th, which is my birthday. And so just a little bit about me. As president of the National Society of Professional Journalists, we have some plans for December 15th because of the consequence of those days and because of the two hats that I'll be wearing, my birthday hat and the hat as the president of SPJ. So I work at the San Diego Union Tribune. Here's us putting the U in journalism. I like to use that line because journalism is not a one-way street, it's a two-way street. You got to keep your audience in mind. That's the first rule of journalism in 2020. Because if you don't, you're going to be kind of doomed to mediocrity and not really have an audience, right? I like to say that in the old days, we would come down from the mountaintop of our newsroom, mostly white men, and literally hand out stone tablets that couldn't be shared couldn't be changed, right, for 24 whole hours. So if you made a mistake, that's too bad. Nowadays, information is flying around the internet at a rapid rate. That means misinformation, disinformation, and information. So the onus is really on journalists, as I'll explain in a few slides here, to get it right. And as you're all learning, that's a responsibility that almost all of us take very, very seriously, right? One important thing I want to note up front is journalists do make mistakes. We're human, but we correct them. And that's one of the reasons how you can tell fake news from real news, right? So this is our office building in downtown San Diego. We moved in there a few years ago. This is my office now. It's the desk. It's neater than it is than my desk at the office, but this is the desk in my bedroom where my colleagues and I have been putting out newspapers for 6 months from the discomfort of our homes, I'll say. That means I have 2 teammates who work on a podcast. They're recording under blankets in closets. But this is how seriously we take journalism, the First Amendment, the public's right to know. So we do the best we can, and we and other media outlets have been doing the same thing, not just newspapers, obviously, TV stations, radio stations. We're all doing the news from our houses. Fake news isn't new. This is an image from 1894, Puck magazine. You can find it online, which is where I found it. You see these 3 dapper-looking gents in bowler hats holding copies of Cheap Sensation, Fake News, and Humbug News. Now, I wish that Humbug News is the term of art that had taken off because it's more fun. Fake news isn't quite so fun, and it's dangerous, as we're going to talk about. So what is fake news, right? In my view, it operates on a spectrum. There's misinformation and disinformation. You have misinformation on one side, which is poor journalism, journalism without context, maybe not enough sources, not enough variety of voices. And on the other side is the real dangerous aspect of fake news, disinformation, which is propaganda, hoaxes, conspiracy theories. You guys all have heard of Pizzagate, I'm sure. Profitganda is a relatively new term. It's propaganda for money, right? So you had in the 2016 election, supporters of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump both kind of vilifying their preferred candidate because they could make a buck on a website easily, the way that the system is set up and can be gamed now. And we'll talk a little bit about how a website, how you can find out whether it's the real deal or not. So if we could all talk about real news and agree what real news is, we'd all be better off. Then we wouldn't even have to talk about fake news. You guys can see this slide. So I'll just share the adjectives because that's really where the rubber hits the road and what's most important. Real, honest, actual, true, real again. That's all real news is, right? But importantly, I want to point out that there is two key points about real news, about journalism. One is it includes a wide range of people, subjects, and sources, right? So you have to include all those diverse voices. I talked earlier about how back in the day, and even still in some newsrooms, the bulk of reporting is done by white men. That's on us to diversify the ranks, both in staff and in management. And just as an aside, the Union Tribune this year started publicly releasing the diversity data, the demographics of our staff. And we release it by staff and management because both are important. So the public can see for themselves, what our staff looks like. And importantly, we'll update that with regularity going ahead. That's a super important part of journalism because you need to reflect your community in order to have the community trust you and trust your journalism. So that's point one. And I see some chatter in the Q&A. I'm not monitoring that now, but definitely as you have questions as I roll through this, send them there so you don't forget them, and then I can go back to the beginning and answer all the questions in the time allowed at the end. So the two key aspects of journalism, of real news, one is that wide range of voices, and two is we got to be mindful that people can view the same facts differently, right? And I'm not saying that climate change, for example, you give the doubters the same amount of space that you would give the scientists. who have shown us that not only is climate change real, but it's man-made, right? But it's an acknowledgement that people have different points of view. And so as young journalists, one of the things that I urge all journalists to do, especially young journalists, is make sure that you don't just read the journalism from your personal point of view. If your politics are to the left or to the right, read politics on the other side. Read journalism on their side. There's plenty of good outlets doing work on the right and the left, as well as all of the news sources that try to go down the middle, like Reuters and AP and magazines like The Economist. So here's what journalists do on a daily basis, right? We are mindful of our own biases and blind spots, what I just told you about. We got to kind of get outside of our bubbles. We don't impose them on others, right? Journalism, you can see the slides, I'm not going to go through every bullet point, but the best journalism, news journalism, allows readers to draw their own conclusions. If you're reading a piece and you're starting to feel like you're pulled in one direction, you know, that's probably an opinion piece and it should be labeled as such. Now, I am the editorial and opinion director of the Union Tribune. So I've been working for the last 5 years in the opinion sphere. But before that, I was a longtime news reporter and a columnist. And so I kind of came up from that side of the business where I would literally count the column inches and number of quotes on either side of a controversial or contentious issue, so that when that person that I quoted inevitably called me up and complained, I could say, no, this is how seriously I took it, right? So this is part of journalism too, is making sure that everyone feels like they were treated fairly and that you didn't impose your point of view in your news story. And this last one I just want to spend a second on because it's important. There shouldn't really be a surprise in the story for your subjects. If you're going to write about something, you should ask them about it. You should quote them accurately. If you have a question, it's not outside the realm of possibility to read back a quote to a person to make sure that you got it right. They'll trust that. They'll feel like you are going out of your way to be fair to them, and that source you'll develop a long relationship with that source. The watchdog team at the Union Tribune, for example, has a 24-hour policy where if we're going to, kick a bad guy in the teeth, so to speak, we're going to let them know because maybe we have it wrong. Maybe they can persuade us that the facts should be seen in a different light, and we should reflect our journalism to show that. So a 24-hour window allows that neutrality, that sense of fairness to come to the fore. Now, usually I'm given this presentation in person, and this is one of the funnest parts of it. But this slide is great. Normally what I do is I show an actual headline from the real internet, and I have a show of hands that show, whether this is fake, real, or I don't know. And that third answer is super important in this day and age where it's really getting harder and harder to know what you're digesting and whether it's real or not. But because we're doing this digitally, I'm just going to kind of zip through these and explain to you what they are and why I'm using them as examples. Headline number 1, CDC doctor, disastrous flu shot is causing deadly flu outbreak. Now, most people, when I ask fake or real, think this is fake, which it is. It's fake, largely because flu shots don't cause flu outbreaks, right? Again, we're talking about science and making sure that you present the facts as they are. So anytime you see something that seems a little questionable, take it with a grain of salt. Don't just share it without reading it. You see this kind of headline a lot too. I hope there's some Dolly Parton fans in the house. Amazing singer and just as good an actress, and she's having a moment with books now too. So this headline, singer Dolly Parton, quote, "Trump in 1 year is already better than 16 years of Bush and Obama put together." This is also fake. You see this kind of headline a lot. Celebrity X says thing Y that you're either super going to love or super going to hate. And so it's designed to play to your emotions. And if you're feeling it really, a headline really, really getting you emotional, it might just be a good headline. But then again, it might be designed to trick you into thinking it's true when it's not. Oop, I clicked through this one. Here you go. This is one of my faves. Outback employees. Hope there's some Bloomin' Onion fans in the house. Outback employees return from mandatory 6-month walkabout in Australian wilderness. Now, this is an example of sarcasm. Another super popular headline type of headline you'll see floating around the internet. Fine to share this, super funny. We all get a laugh out of it. This will actually take you to a website called The Onion, which is where it's from, which if you're not familiar, you should be. It's one of the best fake news, in quotes, in its best terminology, if there is such a thing, online, right? So it's just headlines that are designed to make you laugh or make you think. And just really quickly on fake news, I want to say, so we had a convention SBJ did last weekend, and we gave a tribute to Gwen Ifill, who's an amazing journalist since passed, who is now on stamps. So next time you're at the post office, if you go there during the pandemic, ask for Gwen Ifill on your stamps, because it's amazing to send a letter in the mail and have an amazing journalist be on the cover. A line was said about Gwen that she hated the term fake news, because if it's news, it's not fake, right? So keep that in mind too, that the whole terminology is ridiculous. And here, because one of these has to be real, pipe bomb handed back to passenger by airport guard, right? Now, the example here I share is because, this is all about media literacy, if it seems too good to be true, it still might be true. This is not a TSA blunder. This happened in Canada. So cue the Blame Canada song. You know, sometimes headlines can be right when you don't think they are. Here, I'm going to zip through these next few slides. There's this more than any other chart you'll see really crystallizes the moment when fake news became a problem, right? So here what you see, this is the 2016 election year. You guys all know what Facebook engagements are. Some older audiences don't when I share this slide, but it's, you know, a measure of shares, reactions, and comments on Facebook. And so what you see here is fake news doing what fake news should do, which is toiling in obscurity, right? No one's paying attention. 3 million is pretty relatively obscure for most of the beginning of 2016. And mainstream news doing what mainstream news does all too well, which is find reasons for fewer and fewer people to read it, right? So we're losing our audience for a lot of other reasons, which we can, that's a whole other talk. But then what happens in the months leading up to the election is more people are reading and sharing the fakest news stories than they are reading and sharing the biggest mainstream news stories. So that's when this problem became huge. As you saw from that earlier slide, the president and other politicians who throw fake bomb around like a weapon did not invent the term, right? It dates back to at least the 1800s, but it really became a problem in 2016, right? And here just really quickly, I want to take you through an example of how quickly a fake news headline can really rocket around the internet. Here you have Pope Francis shocks world, endorses Donald Trump for president. Now, as you may know, Pope Francis does not endorse in any election, let alone American elections. But here's how this story came to be so massive that the Pope had to himself address it multiple times. First, it shows up on some website, WTOE 5 News. Yeah, maybe that's a TV station in Dubuque or some other town in the country. Maybe it's real. No. If anyone's from Dubuque, I don't mean to pick on you. And then a fake news publisher called Ending the Fed picks it up. Well, that sounds legit. Maybe that's a blog of someone who has some legitimacy. Oh, wait a second. You do a little bit of research, you find out that the original site is down, and when it was up, it had a disclaimer that said most posts here are satire or pure fantasy. Yet this takes on a life of its own, so much so that a month before the 2016 election, Pope Francis is saying, I never say a word about electoral campaigns, right? On election day, the piece has 1 million shares, reactions, and comments. And a month after the election, Pope Francis is still talking about it, trying to distance himself from this. And he gave an interview with the Belgian Catholic Weekly, calling it a sin and a sickness. Now, problem, right? One of the things you'll see here that all good journalists do is if you had this deck in front of you, you could click through where it says Reuters, BuzzFeed, Tertio, and CNBC. These are all hyperlinks, and you could verify for yourself that I'm not just making this up, that I'm using data from reliable, reputable news sources. Here's the problem in one chart: trust in the media. This is the last 20 or so years, and in the late 90s, it's doing okay. More than half the country trusts the media to report the news fully, accurately, and fairly, but it's going in the wrong direction. And in 2016, when the big problems happened, 1 in 3 Americans trust the media. Now, it started to creep up. Media has realized that this is a moment where we have to tell the truth and get the message out. But between 2018 and 2019, it's dipping again. Media outlets have made some mistakes, maybe not corrected them as quickly as they should. Others are weaponizing fake news. And you have, from the president on down, folks who have the media in their, are targeting the media. So what do we do about it? This is something to keep in mind as you young journalists go out into the world. When you go to an interview, ask them, how do you explain your journalism to the public? And here, I hope you guys can see this slide. It's Our Journalism Explained. What it shows is a microsite on our site where you can see how we distinguish real news from fake news, news from opinion. We have a fairness checklist that walks you through the efforts we go through, and there you see our 24-hour window of response time. How we talk about language and how we go to great lengths to make sure it's neutral language. Even how we tackle sources. We actually have a committee at the interview now that's trying to figure out the best way to use sources, and importantly, how to decide when someone should not be a source at all. You're not going to quote a racist in your story. Here's how we handle editors, and here's letters and op-eds for those who want to send those to us. Right, so building audience, super important. Most of the people I'm talking to today are from Generation Z, which is, you guys are an amazing generation. It's, as you may know, it's the most racially and ethnically diverse. And here is a project that we just completed this week. Pretty amazing, right? Journalism is not just words on a page, dull, black and white. It's vibrant. It has this kind of self-repeating GIF at the top. We have a video here. I'm just going to scroll through a little bit. It's a 9-episode miniseries podcast. If you go to Hello Gen Z on Twitter and Facebook and Insta, you'll see it, right? Here we have an interactive timeline so you can see what each generation is known for. And the podcasts show me, a lot of people are feeling kind of hopeless right now on all sides of the political spectrum. And I think your generation is, it gives me hope. And so I appreciate that and the work that you all are doing. Now, newspaper, like I said, this is a typical newspaper page. I'm just gonna spend some time talking about media literacy and the difference between news and opinion, right? So this is an editorial page of a modern newspaper. You have a cartoon, an editorial, letters to the editor, and a syndicated column. When I took over the job, it was pretty plug and play. These were the components every day. Half the week, we had a second page for op-eds, community essays from experts, and experienced voices. Now, this is not what our page looks like every day anymore, because doing the same thing is the quickest way to become irrelevant. So here, just a few examples. During the pandemic, and I appreciate all the work you all are doing, distance learning and trying to stay on top of your schooling and be with your families and all the rest of it. It's super difficult time, not just for journalism in the industry, but for humanity, really, and particularly for communities of color. Here in San Diego County, it's no different. Latinos, the AAPI community, Native Americans, Blacks, the Black community, are all disproportionately affected by the virus in terms of hospitalizations, in terms of contraction of the virus, in terms of dying from COVID-19. And so here, to help, I wanted to do something different that would make an impact. And so we wrote an editorial that said one of the first priorities of our county Department of Health should be helping Latinos. We're a border community in San Diego. It's one of the busiest land crossings in the world. We need to have testing sites at the border. We need to help people who live north of the border and south of the border make sure that they're getting the help they need. So we wrote that editorial the way you would write an editorial in any newspaper on any given day. And then we translated it in Spanish and ran the same editorial in Spanish below it as a show that this is how serious we take this issue. One innovative way that journalism can be done differently day to day. Here are a few examples. First of all, a really quick aside, on election night, I hope you guys all know that the story isn't who lost, but who won the election. So this cartoon here on the lower left of the eagle and the Trump pompadour is the cartoon that ran in our newspaper the day after the 2016 election. Here is an essay that our political cartoonist, who's won 2 Pulitzers, wrote explaining why he targets Trump in his cartoons. We actually did the math and found out that he was a year and a half into his presidency doing more cartoons than he had for President Obama. And so he explained why that is. Here's an editorial, a full-page editorial we did after the El Paso Walmart shooting, where we wanted to speak out against hate. And here's an interesting example of Steve using a cartoon in a vertical space rather than a horizontal space. Here's a couple of his cartoons that speak to this moment and how to cover politics in this election. You know, here, if any of you guys have seen the movie Stand By Me, this is kind of a callback to that. You have Trump taking a baseball bat to the United States postal system. Here, and if you notice, there was no words in this cartoon other than USPS. Here, another example of a cartoon without words besides the Biden-Harris call out on her lectern. And here, the point isn't about politics, but a message about what it means to have Kamala Harris in this position for young girls of color, especially. Now, any baseball fans in the house will appreciate this. I'm a huge baseball fan myself. This was what Steve did on opening day to get at baseball during a pandemic and the lunacy of it. Real quickly, I'm kind of winding down and then I'll open it up for questions. This is important as you guys pursue journalism, whether it's in the context of an election or just anything else. This is the editorial that we did on the 19th anniversary of the Columbine school shooting. I asked one of my teammates to just look at the last near 2 decades of school shootings and get a list of everyone who had died in them. And I wanted to make a point that something needs to change, something needs to stop. So what you have here is a full-page editorial where we took the names and ages of everyone who died in a particular year from 1999 on. And after a lot of brainstorming about how to present that information, we just decided to present it as that data point in this kind of ragged right text to spell out the word enough. Now, this is beautiful in print. It gives me chills and goosebumps still looking at it now. And I must have, spent little hours looking at this page. But that's not going to translate to online. So here's how we represented it online. That gives me goosebumps too, especially when you see the 6-year-olds from Sandy Hook. So as you're pursuing your journalism, think of the medium, think of the message, think of how to make it powerful in different mediums. And here, I'm going to try to play this. Can you guys in the chat just let me know if you can hear this? Just in the Q&A, say yes or no. Okay. Yeah, I wondered about that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Bailing to send this to you guys because it's an important piece of journalism, but the audio gives me issues sometimes. What that is we, after the shooting in El Paso, we asked local Latinos to write us essays about how they were feeling about this moment and being in public spaces, even in San Diego, right? That was a shooting that specifically targeted a certain community. Horrendous as it was. And so we asked a bunch of people, we kind of solicited them from some prominent Latinos in town, but also I wrote an editorial that said, if you are Latino and want to weigh in on this, we'll publish it. And just so regular people wrote in, and we published those over 2 days. And then we shared this video, which unfortunately I can't show you right now, where they read their essays on camera and we collected it in this 2-hour video. It's so powerful. And so as you're doing your journalism, make sure you're connected to the core of it, the emotions of it, right? Super important. So criticism, big part of the job, right? We get criticized every day, all day, and we shouldn't suffer the slings and arrows. I'm going to just tell you a little bit about that, though. It's important to engage your critics, to take them seriously, which is not the same thing as saying feed the trolls. If someone is being nasty to you, being sexist, being racist, being xenophobic, do not deal with them. Block them, mute them. I used to say feed the trolls, and now I say you can get in a Twitter fight or engage someone who's being a jerk, or you can spend that time doing journalism. Do the journalism. At the same time, credibility is super important. We need to keep it, maintain it, which means we can't make mistakes of our own on social media, right? So this is my favorite. I showed you that full page editorial after the El Paso shooting. One person wrote in, this is the same person, using multiple writing devices to explain to us that not only do we suck, but saying, what grammar school do you all go to? Now, as you can see, anyone who knows how to spell grammar and school, sometimes critics don't always use the right language. I'm here to tell you right now, do not, as tempting as it is, and I sometimes even still do the, no, it's without an apostrophe back to these critics, don't go for the low-hanging fruit. You know what I mean? If someone has criticism to you, engage them on the merits, but don't waste your time with that. Now here I want to show this because this is what's different. This is a letter written to our publisher not long after I'd taken the job as the editorial opinion director. And as you can see, it's someone who's been a subscriber for 50 or 60 years, writing to tell me that Matthew Hall needs to be fired. He is the wrong man for the UT. He labels LABLES Donald Trump a demagogue, but it is Hall himself who is fitting of his classification. Now, I could have stopped there and thrown this in the trash because I know, A, this person is a sexist. He says he's the wrong man. I know that he's a jerk because he's saying that I should be fired rather than bringing up the merits of his point. But I kept reading, and here's why, and why it's important. Because he writes something that is a good point. People who support Trump are genuinely concerned about the direction this country is headed. Now, I know some people say that some of the people who support Trump are racist or sexist, and sure, some of those people fall into that category. But a lot of Trump supporters feel left out and left behind, and saw something in the way that he was talking in his populism in 2016 that made them vote for him. I mean, he got tens of millions of votes. And so when you're working in journalism, you need to realize that you got to put your feelings aside, especially if you're on the news side, and make sure that you're handling everyone. Sorry, I got someone mowing our lawn right here, in case you're hearing that activity. So listen to your critics. Now here's just the last couple slides before I take questions. These are the 4 core tenets of SBJ's Code of Ethics. Seek the truth and report it, minimize harm, act independently, be accountable and transparent. What that means is not only look for the story, but find a way to get it in your outlets, minimize harm to yourself, to your outlet, to your subjects, to the industry, act independently, be accountable, right? That's why social media is great, because you can be on it and answer questions of people. And here, in the interest of time, I'm going to zip to the last slide. Those earlier slides were this slide fashioned in a different way. This is to you, not as journalists, but as news consumers, and as journalists, because this is what people should be looking for. But as you're sharing your work or looking at work, keep all this stuff in mind. ESCAPE is the acronym. Evidence, sourcing, context, audiences, purpose, and execution. These are questions you should ask yourself as you're trying to figure out if the story you're reading is legit. You can easily verify facts, so look and see if they hold up. If names are misspelled, then you know it's not, people make mistakes, but every name in a story shouldn't be misspelled. Know a little bit about the outlet, right? Outlets should have, and ask these questions when you go to interviews, if you haven't looked at the website already. They should have email access for the reporters, a bio page that lists where that journalist went to school, what their levels, areas of expertise are. Make sure the story reflects the big picture. Think of who the audience is. Ask yourself about motivation. Is this someone trying to pull the wool over your eyes? And look at how the story is presented, right? Especially, this one comes up a lot, make sure that the image choice is neutral. A lot of times people are in a hurry and they grab a photo because they think it's the right one. It may not be. And so a lot of times journalists should change that and make sure that those photos also, as well as the words, don't kind of push people to one side or another. And now I'm going to stop sharing and zip into the Q&A, where I always see a ton of comments.
So thank you so much, Matt, for your presentation. I'm going to introduce our Q&A moderator, Cameron Winston. So Cameron, if you would turn on your camera. Cameron is a senior communications major with an emphasis in journalism, and he's the creator of the Soul of the Game podcast. He's also the president and the founder of the Cal State Fullerton chapter of the National Association of Black Journalists. So I'm going to let you all go ahead and do the Q&A, which Cameron will read from the contributions of our audience members. And, you know, I'm really looking forward to hearing all of Matt's answers. And I hope you appreciate my homage to the notorious RBG.
I love it.
All right, let me scroll up real quick. All right, so the first question comes from Sarah Avery. How do you give a voice to those on the other side without amplifying people who are spreading dis or misinformation?
Great question. In many ways, the question. I mean, a lot of times it's on the journalist to make sure to go to extra lengths that you're getting the information. So you have to do your due diligence, ask for documents, ask for multiple sources. You know, the old adage is if your mother says she loves you, check it out. Trust but verify is a simpler term, kind of example of that. There's a lot of ways to spread false information, and journalists need to be mindful of that. There's an anecdote that just happened in San Diego where an outlet in town published in a really big ongoing scandal a document that had a fabricated footnote. And it was called Fabricated Footnote 15 in San Diego. Just Google it. It's crazy. And they had to retract the story and admit to it. And so sometimes we get took, and we need to be upfront and explain how it happened and make sure that it doesn't happen again. Thank you for the question.
And then from Nick, yes. My question is, how do we journalists minimize or avoid the risk of doing false equivalence in reporting? And he points out examples like in politics, legal issues, and if in social issues. And in this case, how do we give those who support gender and racial equality the same airtime as those who oppose gender and racial equality, as an example for like fair reporting?
Yeah, I think that's a great example. And I'll give you a concrete one. Police accounts of events. You're seeing kind of a reckoning around the country with police brutality and racial justice. And more journalists are realizing that just because the police said it doesn't make it so. There was an example just last weekend in LA where a KPCC reporter, after a horrific event where 2 sheriff's deputies in Los Angeles were shot and were in critical condition in the hospital, there was a protest outside the hospital and a reporter was trying to cover it. And she was thrown into a car and basically detained by 5 deputies who were on top of her. And she, if you go back and look at the video, if you haven't already, she's saying, "I'm with KPCC, I'm a reporter." She must say reporter 3 times in KPCC 10. The sheriff said that she didn't identify herself as a reporter, that she didn't have media credentials. She's wearing a lanyard with an ID right on her. So the sheriff's deputies are lying flat out. Don't fool yourself and think that the police don't lie. You know, many police are in it for the right reasons and do amazing work under very difficult circumstances. But like in journalism, there are some that don't. We famously know the George Floyd situation and too many others to get into here. But I'll just as one example, listen to all sides. And so if there are protesters in that situation, listen to them too, And so I guess you can kind of put that in many circumstances, some of which the questioner did. But I would use that one example to show that don't give weight to one side or the other just because they're coming from a place of authority. Trust involves a lot of aspects, and journalists need to listen to that too. It's a great question.
And then a question from, I apologize if I pronounce anyone's names wrong, but Giovanni Alciba Guzman. What is your honest opinion on Frank Luntz? Is it a far-fetched idea to compare him to Joseph Goebbels? My bad if I pronounced that wrong too.
I'm not sure of the context of that. I think anytime you're comparing someone to a Nazi, that's a pretty strong comparison. And a lot of times those Nazis stand on their own for how, we're talking about this on Rosh Hashanah, right? So I would say be mindful of comparisons. And I don't know the circumstances of specifics of what we're talking about with Frank here. I'm happy if someone wants to email me to give you some thoughts, but be mindful of comparisons, I guess is my takeaway there.
And a question from Jessica. Some argue that traditional standards of objectivity are designed to appear a middle or upper class white male reader, and that reporting with moral clarity about things like systemic racism is a better approach. How do you draw the line in being comprehensive and balanced while also acknowledging some things aren't two-sided issues? Yeah.
Racism is not a pro-con package. Sexism, not a pro-con package. That is a great question. And I think you're seeing, I told you earlier that we're sharing our demographic data. I think the racial reckoning that's happening in this country is long overdue. Many people, including journalists of color, have been engaged in this fight and effort for decades. And I think what we're starting to see now is journalists taking it more seriously. So you see at outlets like the LA Times and the Washington Post, journalists who are calling their own managers out and demanding not just a job, but a seat at the table and a voice and improvements. And Los Angeles, which is, I hate to keep picking on the city of LA, but Los Angeles, which is 50% Latino, has far less Latino and Latinx journalists on their staff than a city with that big of a Latino population should. So, I think you're right. And I said that at the outset, that a lot of times in the newsrooms were largely old white men. And as an oldish white man, I'm working really hard, both through SBJ and through my team at the UT, to make sure that that women and journalists of color are not just part of this package. I'll close with one quote to answer this question. Nicole Hannah-Jones, who you guys all know, is New York Times Magazine writer. She's behind the 1619 Project, which is a pretty incredible piece of journalism that won a Pulitzer Prize, also the subject of some controversy. But she says, diversity isn't checking boxes. Diversity is reflecting your audience so that it trusts you. And this isn't a math game. This is an existential moment for media outlets that have for far too long not taken it seriously, to make sure that they do get those voices. And so at the Union Tribune, on my team, what I've done is I've created a community voices project, which has about 60 people from around the county, people of different political views and ethnicities and geographies and genders, to write about any issue they want, right? The op-ed section of a newspaper is usually, no, we're going to ask you, you have to do it by 750 words. You have to do it by this deadline. These people can write whenever they want, however they want, whatever they want. And it's a way to show our community that we're listening. We also have a community advisory board, right? To your point about our editorial board is 3 white men, 1 white woman, a Latina, and a mixed race woman who's Vietnamese. And we have this community advisory board, which is way more diverse and is able to communicate problems as they see it from the community to us, be a sounding board for us, right? The work is on us. To your point, and to answer it succinctly, it's up to white people to do the work to make sure that these voices are being reflected. So I take your question and the spirit with which it was intended to heart.
And I think we have time for just one last question. Someone says,
I'll try to keep my answers a little. I'll try to keep my answers a little shorter. I just get passionate.
Sometimes I get overwhelmed by by all the news I'm consuming, especially in 2020, and I start feeling disillusioned, and it gets difficult to keep that out of my writing. Do you have any advice, or is there anything you do personally to support your mental health and well-being as a journalist?
I am very glad that we got to this question because my mental health is frayed. I'm going to be honest with you. I got two. I got a 14-year-old and a 12-year-old at home who are distance learning. And if you had told me what the over-under was for swearing at them in the last 6 months, I would have told you 0. And I can't even count. So, I don't mean to take it out on my daughters. They're amazing people who are struggling very well, but I'm struggling too. My wife's a journalist. She's struggling. We're lucky enough to have a house. We're lucky enough to have jobs. We got furloughed, but those furloughed pay cuts are gone now. This is hard. This is the biggest story we've ever covered. And anyone who covers it, all you have to do is walk out your door and you're covering it, but you're also living it, right? So it's a dangerous time for any journalist, particularly journalists of color. Black journalists are watching Black Americans be killed. Latino journalists, as we talked about, being impacted by the pandemic. And I know I said I keep my answer short, but mental health is important. To answer your question specifically about what you can do, take time for yourself. Realize it's okay to not be okay. If you need to take a day, take the day. I told my team early on, look, we're a small team, and it's when one person is out, we all got to scramble. But if you need the day, take it. No questions asked. I'm going to give it to you. That's the moment we're living in. You got to take care of yourself first, because you got to take care of yourself so you can do the work. If you're not operating on most cylinders, on all cylinders, your community is less because you're not in that seat. So if you need a day, take a day. If you can't take a day, take half a day. If you can't plug out, you gotta shut off your phone and walk away from it. I see I'm getting the hook from Bailing.
It's not so much the hook. I'm just blown away by your answers. Thank you, Matt, so much for the time that you took with us this morning. Thank you, Cameron, for moderating the Q&A. I'm so sorry we didn't get a chance to answer all of the questions that are posed, but we'll save them maybe for the panel in the 11 o'clock hour. So I just want to say that, Matt mentioned at the end of his presentation that journalism is one of the best ways to leave the world a better place. And I think we can agree that another way to leave the world a better place is to participate in democratic society by voting on issues that matter to the future of our nation and to the future of the world. So if you are eligible to vote, please register to do so. Matt mentioned earlier his birthday, so I will say my birthday is October 19th, which is the registration deadline-ish for the state of California. And that would be the best present that y'all could give me. In our Golden State, the online voter registration system is maintained by the Office of the Secretary of State, as shown on the slide. So please do register. Now, sometimes college students who are very, very busy people need some extra flexibility with school the week of November 3rd. So if this sounds like you, please ask your professors to contact me about joining in our initiative called #MyVoteMyVoice. This is actually a faculty-led initiative in the College of Communications to encourage college professors to rework their classes to enable students to vote, no matter who they vote for. So now as we get ready to start the 11 o'clock hour, let's say thank you once again to Matt Hall for his wonderful keynote. And thank you as well to Cameron Winston for being our Q&A moderator today.
Thank you. Thank you, Cameron, for those questions. Thank you all. I really appreciate the moment.
Thank you for the opportunity.
So now we're going to try to elevate our panelists. This Zoom technology is great, but we're all learners here, right? So let's try now to transition to our panel of journalists who will share their experiences and their insights on covering elections. While we do that, I'm going to go ahead and give all of us permission to catch our breath for 3 minutes, because as Matt said, sometimes we just have to take the time to give ourselves some time. All right, so I'm going to give us 3 minutes to take a break, and we'll come back at the 11 o'clock hour. See y'all real soon. So I'm going to welcome everyone back to our Student Journalism Symposium on covering elections. So now, as we start the 11 o'clock hour, we'll transition to our panel of journalists who will share their experiences and their insights on covering elections. So let me briefly introduce our panelists. First up, we have Arit John, who is a staff writer with the Los Angeles Times. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
And next, we have Laura Barrón-López, who is a national political reporter with POLITICO.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Then we have Quinn Owen, who is a reporter and producer with ABC News based in Washington, D.C.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Shaw.
And last, we have Vania Patino, who is a reporter with the CBS affiliate station KFDA News Channel 10 in Amarillo, Texas. So I know that this audience has a lot of questions, and we'll be sure to save some time at the end to get to all of them. But I do have some starter questions just to get everyone going. And a reminder for our audience, for those who are joining us just now, if you have questions, please use, if you can, the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen so we can save some time for audience questions. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Associate Dean, Dr. Deanna Leone, who is monitoring the Q&A and also serving as today's event manager. We really couldn't do this without her, so thank you, Dr. Leone. So now for our first question, and the panelists can just answer it in the order in which you were introduced. Tell us briefly what you do on the job each day, and give us an example of an election-related story that you have covered or produced.
I'm at the LA Times. I've been there since February, and I'm covering the 2020 election. So since coronavirus has sort of basically changed the way that elections are running right now, I've been really focused on absentee ballot voting and vote by mail in general, just how different states are changing their laws, sort of the controversy surrounding it. And one story that I did recently was I profiled Washington Secretary of State Kim Wyman. She's a Republican, but they've been doing vote by mail there since 2011, I think. And so I just sort of talked to her about how they make it safe and what it's like sort of being like a Republican supporter of something that's been sort of denigrated by the president.
Hi, I'm Laura Barrón-López, and I'm with POLITICO. So I'm a national political reporter. I cover the 2020 presidential election as well. I have a focus on different demographic groups, so Black voters, Latino voters, Asian voters, and really diving into white voters as well, like just the different demographics that make up the electorate. And when coronavirus hit, I also briefly helped lead our coverage in terms of the disparities of who the coronavirus infected and disproportionately killed. And that was Black, Latino, and Native Americans. Today, I actually, even though it's the weekend, have been helping some of my colleagues on stories about what comes next due to Justice Ginsburg's death. And so I've been texting a few lawmakers this morning, asking about what Democrats exactly could do if they wanted to try to block McConnell's move to push forward a nomination. Also, a story that I wrote that published on Friday was a deep dive into some underperformance among young Black men, young Latino men in particular, and what Joe Biden, the Democratic nominee, is exactly doing to try to reach those voters, because he's trying to get back to some Obama-level numbers, if he can, among those voters. And they could ultimately be very crucial if this is a tight race in states like Michigan and Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania.
Hi, everyone. My name's Quinn. Dr. Shaw introduced us, and thank you again for having us on the panel. My focus at ABC is immigration policy and the way the Trump administration has been affecting change on that front, and the restrictions they've brought down both at the southern border on humanitarian claims that are made as folks cross, And as we see also a crackdown through the legal established immigration system, USCIS. I primarily am responsible for covering those federal agencies through the Department of Homeland Security. So my work also overlaps with the national security space and tracking developments through DHS. And one of the storylines we've covered throughout this administration has been the turnover at the agency. Most recently, the acting secretary was nominated as to be the secretary of the agency, and that confirmation battle is still ahead. So we will be tracking that closely, but I think an example of something that we've covered out of that, I mean, are really the day-by-day updates. And when we can, the things that I'd like to really focus on is when we can translate that into a public service, how it's impacting people day to day, and how it's impacting, what people are able to do through our immigration system. One story I did recently was a profile of doctors who are working on H-1B visas. And those doctors now have more restrictions because of the coronavirus on how they can apply. But the Trump administration's rhetoric that we hear on the immigration front doesn't give us any indication of when those restrictions might be lifted or when we can see an end date. Of course, the CDC orders on that are to be readdressed in the future. We know that there's an ongoing travel. We know that there are ongoing travel restrictions and just process restrictions on the systems that are responsible for, having those visas get adjudicated, decided, and ultimately granted or denied. So that's been our major focus. The coronavirus has complicated it, of course, incredibly, but we've been sticking with it for now. Thank you.
Vania.
And hi, everyone. I'm Vania. I am actually a CSUF graduate, so I'm super happy to be here with all of you. I'm a general assignment reporter for the CBS affiliate in Amarillo, Texas. So I don't specifically focus on just politics, but because I love politics, I do end up getting a lot of those stories. So I covered the Republican primary for the 13th Congressional District here in Texas. And I would talk a little bit about that experience. Basically, I had only been here for about a month, so I had to familiarize myself with just the kind of voters that we have here, because it's very different to, of course, where I'm from, California. I'm actually in a district where it had the highest percentage of votes for Donald Trump, which of course you guys know that's not what happens in California. So kind of understanding the people here and getting ready to cover this election, this primary, sorry. And also the fact that it was live TV, right? So we were talking about biases and we were talking about framing and the media trust. And when it comes to live TV, like, you have to keep all of that in mind as well. So when I was framing myself, instead of counting how many quotes I had from each party supporters, I had to look at, okay, what's behind me? Are there more signs from one candidate than the other? When I was doing my live shots, if I saw that there were people coming behind me, but not the other party, I had to, think about, okay, let's pan over here. Let's look at what the people on this side are doing, so that the camera wouldn't be focusing on, just one political candidate. So there's a lot of things that go on for live TV as you're covering an election. And it's a lot of things going on, a lot of moving pieces. You have to be on your toes the whole time. So that was kind of my experience just covering that primary runoff here.
So we already have a lot of questions in the chat, so I'm going to not cover all of the starter questions that I sent to the panelists. Several of you already alluded to a lot of the different issues that the current election is about at both local levels as well as national levels. And we know that all elections are about a diverse set of issues. So tell us, in your opinion, what are one or two issues that you believe are really key for people to understand the current elections that you are covering, and tell us why you think these particular issues are so important for our understanding. So whoever would like to go first, just jump on in.
I'd be happy to jump in on that, Dr. Shah. I really do, as Matt Hall talked a lot about checking your bias, and I'll check my bias on in a meta way on this. But I have to say, immigration policy, that being my focus, it's still going to have a big impact this election year, because the executive branch has an enormous amount of latitude over how they control the borders. It's one of the fundamental components of the nation state is a state's border. So the presidential election, if we're talking about where those impacts are going to be, will be in the immigration space as far as immediate impacts go. The president has the ability to drive funding for things like the border wall, direct congressional funding to the border wall, to clamp down on restrictions. The entire Homeland Security apparatus falls under, of course, the executive branch and the White House, and they have a lot of control in that space. So if we're talking about beats that are going to be, certainly needing attention for journalists, it's going to be the immigration beat.
So I'd like to kind of cover two areas, which is that what voters are focused on right now, based on all of the polling, is coronavirus. It's the economy. Under the economy, there's things about education. There's things about just being able to get a job, not worry about evictions. But all the recent polling has shown that across battleground states, that is what voters are focused on, despite the noise or the distractions that we hear on a regular basis from the president, from other politicians about what this election is going to be about. Now, what happened last night with Ginsburg's passing could very well impact a lot of races. I'm skeptical that it'll fundamentally alter the presidential race, because we've seen so many other things occur that hasn't actually changed the dynamic that much when you look at the polling. Biden has consistently been ahead in battleground states. Voters, when you ask them who they trust more on coronavirus, Biden leads by double digits. When you ask them who they trust more on public safety, policing, criminal justice reform, Biden leads by single digits, but he leads. Now, in terms of what I think voters should also be paying attention to is disinformation. That is a huge element this election cycle. There are conspiracy theories that have grown in size this year, specifically pushed by conspiracy theory groups like QAnon, which the president himself has boosted and he has promoted, and there are likely 2 QAnon supporters that are going to be heading to Congress. So that is a big story this year, and it's something that I think reporters and that the public should be paying attention to, and they should be very wary of what they are seeing on Facebook, on Instagram, and skeptical, and do the due diligence and not believe these memes or these videos without experts or primary sources that have caught fire very aggressively this year. One of them, the Plandemic video that had a debunked scientist saying that the coronavirus was not deadly. So that is a massive story, and it's something that is going to become bigger regardless of who wins the presidential election in November.
And at the local level, I totally agree. Everyone here is talking about the economy. Everyone's worried about getting jobs. Here, a lot of people don't necessarily believe that the coronavirus is real or don't want to agree with what the CDC is saying. So I'll definitely say people are just worried about how they're going to make their rent or how they're going to, where they're going to get their paycheck from, because people are dealing with unemployment. So that I would say that's one of the biggest issues that we're seeing. Again, that can change because, of the passing of the justice, like Laura said. But from what I'm hearing to the people that I'm talking to, they're all for they believe that Donald Trump is handling this correctly. They are for Donald Trump. They don't believe in the coronavirus, which is an issue, I think. And they're worried about the economy. Those are like the biggest issues that I'm hearing, at least from the people that I'm speaking with in my area.
I mean, everyone brought up really good points. I think that the big umbrella issue is like safety. Like, you know, you hear Donald Trump say, are you going to be safe in Joe Biden's America? Even though right now we're living in Donald Trump's America. And I think that every issue kind of falls under that. And each candidate is sort of trying to figure out like, okay, is like Black Lives Matter? Like, do you feel safer when you see your candidate sort of supporting that movement, trying to get accountability from police? Or do you feel safer seeing a candidate sort of condemn that and say, you know, we're not going to defund the police. This country isn't racist, doesn't have a racist history. On education, on healthcare, do you feel safer with a candidate who says he's going to bring about a new healthcare plan? Or do you feel comfortable with a candidate who is going to defend the Affordable Care Act and stop the case going through the courts to upend the Affordable Care Act? And I think that there's not one single issue that, I mean, maybe there, for some voters, there are some issues that they're going to flip on, but I think for most voters, it's going to be a gut check of like, who do I feel safe with? And if you don't think that either candidate is going to make you feel safer, then you might just stay home. And so for the candidates, I think they're just sort of gambling like, okay, what are those key groups that they need to flip in certain states? Like, what are the suburban moms worried about? Like, what do they worry about before they go to sleep? And I think it's the economy. I think it's a lot of issues. And that's sort of my cheating answer of saying that. It's like, do you feel safe?
What's interesting to me is you all named issues that people are thinking about, both in terms of the local level, the state level, the national level. And what strikes me that those issues have in common is that they're all potentially divisive, right? Even safety, Black Lives Matter, the economy, COVID, immigration. These all seem to be issues that are divisive in our society. And it also just seems from media coverage that there's a lot of heightened sensitivity about pretty much everything. So when you're covering elections that are divisive or potentially divisive, what do you recommend our students, journalists do to be in accordance with the SPJ Code of Ethics, as Matt referred to minimize harm and to be accountable and transparent, especially given the declining levels of public trust in the news media right now?
Look, I think that the facts are that the president attempts to make these issues very divisive. When he is tweeting about Black Lives Matter, he's actually encouraged police violence against peaceful protesters. Yes, there have been riots in a number of places, and that's something that reporters have covered as well. What I will say is that what reporters should be doing when we're covering these issues is also provide gut checks in terms of what is the polling actually saying. So the vast majority of the electorate supports pathway to citizenship for Dreamers. The vast majority of the public, about 55%, okay, I can't say a vast majority because it dipped, but about 55% or so support the Black Lives Matter movement and the core tenets of handling discrimination and addressing police brutality. So that's important context when we're writing about what a Republican or a Democratic politician is saying, which is, where is the electorate actually on this? Are they actually that divided? Trump's base very much supports him and supports what he espouses. But making sure that you have that data in there about where exactly the electorate is. And also, I think that, to give an example of Kenosha, when the protests and riots occurred in Kenosha, Wisconsin, in the aftermath of Jacob Blake's shooting by a police officer, which left him paralyzed, there were some outlets and reporters that were quick to say, oh my God, this is going to totally alter the election. I tried to argue with some of my editors let's take a step back for a second. We don't have the data yet to show that this is going to fully alter voters in the suburbs, voters that are in Kenosha. Let's try to wait and see what actually happens. And what actually happened was that, yes, did support for Black Lives Matter drop about 9 points from mid 60s to the mid or high 50s? That happened. Can you say that that actually means that Biden's support dipped? No, you can't. And his support didn't, because actually in Wisconsin, his support held steady. So I think offering that temperature check is very important. I know that it's exciting and eager to think that, oh my God, this one event could potentially alter the course of an election. But it's very important to offer all of the necessary context and what the data is actually showing. So yeah, that's what I'll say about that.
I would say that you have to approach, there are two sort of groups that you approach. You talk to voters and people on the ground, and then you talk to politicians and people in power and staffers and that, like those sort of people. And when you're talking to voters, I try to always remember, like, I know what my biases are. I know that I grew up an hour east of LA in Rancho Cucamonga. Like, I spent most of my life in either California, DC, New York. So like, I know that, you know, I know where what my biases are, but my biases from where I grew up, my biases from what I personally believe, my biases from my family and having parents who are immigrants. So I always keep that in the back of my mind. And then when I'm talking to voters, I know that, okay, this person is a different race, a different gender, a different age, from a completely different place, but the same core issues of like, they believe X because their experience told them that this is why they're concerned about something. I think a good example is in 2017, there was a Senate race in Alabama. It was Roy Moore and Doug Jones, and Roy Moore was the Republican, and he'd been accused of sexual assault when a minor went, sorry if I'm getting the exact details wrong, but basically it was a very, very controversial Senate race because you sort of had Republicans who were saying, why are you guys bringing this up now? And you had Democrats who were saying, like, you know, like this just resonates so deeply. The Me Too movement was happening. And so you go and I'd talk to people, Republicans, suburban women in Alabama, and ask them, like, why are you supporting Roy Moore? And, you know, it's so easy to say, like, what's wrong with you? You're a woman, like, why are you doing this? But then you start talking to people, and there are so many underlying things. There are so many reasons why someone might not believe the accusations. There are so many reasons why someone might want to vote for Roy Moore, like, regardless of that. The distrust of the media, distrust of Democrats, distrust of the timing. And you can't really, like, you sort of have to, like, put that in context and understand that, but just understand that even if you disagree with how that person thinks, like, that is how they feel, and they're a human being, and they're going to read that story when it comes out, and their families are going to read it. And it's one thing if you report what they said and why they think that, and you're fair about it, and another thing to take cheap shots at people. So I think that sort of having compassion for people, especially when their biases are the total opposite of yours, I think is hard, but I think it's important, because you'll never feel bad for writing something fair and accurate about someone, even if they read it and they're like, oh my God, why would you put this in the paper? But you might feel bad about, or be discredited by, just taking cheap shots at people. And then when you look at politicians and people in power, that's a whole different thing. Then you have to sort of think about, like, the words that people use, the motivation behind it. Like, you're going to write a story and someone's going to try and get you to change something. And you have to ask yourself, like, is this fair, accurate? Is this just the spin that they want you to put on it? So I think I'll wrap up because I'm sort of rambling, but I think that it's just sort of, the main thing is, like, yes, you have to know what your biases are and where you stand, and you have to understand what other people's biases are too, and just really try and get to the root of that.
Dr. Shaw, if I could take your question in sort of a different direction, like away from the national big political conversations, a lot of, I guess to that point though, a lot of the way that I think divisiveness presents itself is through aggression and high energy. We see that a lot in all sorts of forums. And I think the way that that applies to actually doing the job of journalism is to sort of set that energy aside where you can, especially when you're on a stage that's high pressure. If you're at a press, and I don't just say stage like a theater stage or a TV broadcast, but a press conference, even if there's only a couple of dozen people there, those situations can be tense and high pressure, and it's just a fact of the job. But I think that a lot of times, when becoming too aggressive, becoming too high energy in those spaces, really at a core point, it just kind of distorts communication. It's just a poor way to communicate. And if you can, do your best to sort of take a step back from that and, just rely on the information, then I think that's the best way to approach those kinds of conversations and approach those kinds of stories. The same thing applies when you're talking to sources too.
So that's a really good point. And let me just ask one of the questions that was in the chat about talking to sources, because, I think Arit made a really good point about how sometimes you have to talk to public officials and politicians and people of position. And then sometimes you have to also talk to just the regular people in their communities with their families. And in both of those cases, I would agree, Quinn, that as journalists, it's important to be mindful of how we come across. So the question in the chat was, as a student journalist right now, especially in California, so many of our classes now are held online. And for students who are in their very first journalism class or writing for the first time for their campus newspaper, how can they get to the people to even ask them the questions, right? Whether it's, with a lot of energy or without a lot of energy. What do you all recommend to our student journalists to get that going?
How can they get to people
to interview?
So I think I kind of know what you're talking about, Bailing. I know the whole, mask and using masks has kind of become a political and divisive issue, even though it really shouldn't. But I ended up doing a story on, people that believe that masks help and people that don't believe in that. And I just used Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and I looked at what people were tweeting. I set my geographical location to Texas or Amarillo, Texas to be specific. And I looked up masks don't work, and I was seeing what people were tweeting, and I reached out to people that were tweeting about it being effective and those that didn't believe in it. So I think for students that are coming up and maybe don't have the resources to call the senator or reach out to the mayor is not going to answer their call, just use your resources like Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, especially right now because we're not allowed to kind of go out and go to a restaurant and just start talking to anybody. I think social media is a great resource for those students. I used it, and I ended up doing a really good piece on just, what this side of the aisle thinks versus this side. And then, sometimes you can get a doctor to go and be more professional on the side to kind of equal or be more, I guess, neutral in your reporting. So for those students, that would be my recommendation. Use your resources. Social media can be super, super useful.
Just to add on to that, that's a really good point. Especially college students know more about social media and how to use apps than we do. I like to think of myself as a young millennial, but I don't understand. I don't understand half the apps. And sometimes that's the story too. How are young people reacting to coronavirus, reacting to the election on social media? Is there a community of people from your school or from different schools who are doing something on Instagram? Or is there someone who's doing something interesting? I know, I'm going to sound old when I say this, but they're sort of the Instagram stories where it's or not a story, but it's a series of pictures and each one has sort of an interesting fact on it or sort of explains an issue in a different way. If there's something like that that's relevant, I think that that's one of the real advantages you guys have, is that you are young and you are more in touch with technology than even like people in their like 20s, 30s, or late 20s, 30s, 40s are. And you should take advantage of that, because you guys are going to be, as college journalists and as like working professionals, you guys are going to be able to pitch stories that everyone else in your newsroom isn't even gonna, like, would never be able to come up with. And then you're going to have to convince them that it's a real story because they don't know. And then when the story does well, then you're like, see, I told you. So just keep that in mind.
So I'd like to stay on, oh, sorry, Laura, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, yes, that Twitter, Instagram, any way you think that you can contact a source, you should do it. You shouldn't be shy about it. You should just DM them. Even at the national level, I will DM senators and House lawmakers if those DMs are open, and it works. So I would recommend doing that. You know, and if you want to talk to everyday voters, like if there's a county in California, you know, or if there's a House district in California that is potentially, you know, you think gonna flip, Cal State Fullerton is actually right in the middle of frontline district. I'm also an alumna. So Gil Cisneros is in a battle. And if you want to, that's the Democrat, incumbent Democrat. So if you want to talk to everyday voters, you know, pick a neighborhood, maybe one that you think in that county or in that district, it could really hinge on. Knock on a few doors, and if people don't want to talk to you, they don't want to talk to you. But if you present yourself as a reporter right off the bat, you do some distance when you talk to them, that's also an option. So I would say don't be shy about using as many avenues as you can to reach sources.
So I'd like to talk a little bit more actually about social media, because we do know that student journalists are very fluent in all of the different social media platforms. But as Matt alluded to in his keynote, there are also many opportunities for incorrect information to be shared on social media. So for student journalists who are using social media, I guess I have two questions for the panel. The first question is, how can student journalists make sure that their peers are not being misled by incorrect information on social media? So that's one, the responsibilities of a journalist in terms of informing their readers. The second question is, how can student journalists make sure that their own social media presence strikes that appropriate balance between being professional and being human, right?
So I think that this question actually applies, you know, whether it's you're a student journalist or a journalist, you know, at the national level, like myself in DC. I would say that, look, if there is disinformation on social media, if there are lies being spouted by politicians, if there are inaccurate information being pushed out by people in power, it is your job to check that. It is your job to say on social media, this is fake, this is not a fact, this is harmful and inaccurate information. In terms of, you know, being professional, but also being myself, I think that on social media, I primarily use Twitter. I've expanded a little bit to Instagram, but national reporters tend to be solely focused on Twitter. That is where most of the action is happening for us. I primarily stick to my reporting. I'll provide, you know, analysis, but I also would say you shouldn't be afraid to be a bit of yourself on Twitter. And I've gone back and forth about how much I just personally want to share about myself in my professional accounts, whether it's Instagram or whether it's Twitter. But I also think this goes back a bit to the question about that you asked earlier, Bailing, about biases. And what I want to say about that is that this panel is not reflective of the majority of news outlets. We are a diverse panel today, and the majority of news outlets in America, whether you're at the national level in DC or New York or not, are predominantly white and they're predominantly male. And so sometimes I think that this question of telling reporters of color to check their biases is based on almost a false premise, because so much of what reporting has been for so long is through a default white lens. It just is. And what we bring when we are hired and go into new newsrooms is a different perspective that is key to covering this country accurately. It's key to covering this country the way it should have always been covered. And because I've been in a newsroom in Politico, which is predominantly white, we do have, thankfully, a number of Black reporters. There's not that many Latinos, there's only a handful of Asians. But it's a predominantly white newsroom, especially on the campaign team. And so I don't think it's not biased that I come in and I say, we need to write some more stories about Latino voters. It's just a fact. We need to write some more stories about Black voters. It's just what needs to be done, because they have not been covered at the same level that white swing voters have been for so long in this country. So I would say lean into your diversity and lean in, whether it's racial and ethnic, whether it's sexual orientation, whether anything that you have, whether it's, I know that we got a question about being a disabled reporter, lean into that and be confident when you're talking to your editors about what should be covered because it's gone missed for so long. And so when we're talking about like objectivity and biases, to me, our job is to be fair, to be transparent. It's not to do a he said, she said story, Republicans, Democrats said this. It's to provide the facts, get to the truth of the matter, and to provide the accurate context and historical context.
That's great advice. Would anyone else like to chime in?
I would just agree. Fact checked everything. I mean, that's your job. Just put the truth out there. Facts. No one's gonna take it personal if you put something like, say, like, hey, this is a scam, or hey, this is actually what's gonna happen. I think they'll be more appreciative and you'll get more respect as well as a journalist.
I think when we're talking about checking information online and on Twitter, and checking your making sure that the way you express yourself is something that you want to be remembered for professionally, you have to really think about how you're using the platform and how that platform is different than the other platforms you might be publishing on. Some of those differences might just seem really obvious. Like if I'm going to write an article for abcnews.com, it's going to be different than when I tweet, but it does take some work to adjust, the way that you're going to tell a story. And that can only come with time and also confidence too. Understand that if you are writing a sentence to put on twitter.com, you should be willing to, defend that going forward. And I think you build that confidence by building up a diverse array of sources. And that's geographic diversity and, more multiplicity to the sources that you're getting information from is just always going to make things, make your stories stronger. That is largely a function of time, and that can always be, of course, a difficult thing to capture when we're covering breaking news. But at the end of the day, it's really the only way to do it, is to make sure that you are you have the sources that you're using, that you're relying on, are not only just reliable people, but also reflect the full spectrum of the issue that you're planning on covering. I think of an example of this is whenever you can whenever you can ping a large group at the same time, that is helpful. We do this a lot. Social media is a natural way of collecting lots of different voices into one space. But if we can do this, on our own more often, by including people on, large emails that we share, including people in happy hour networking events that we go to. Just being generally more inclusive with the way that you establish yourself as a journalist is always going to be the best practice.
I would just add that as far as trying to stop the spread of misinformation, sometimes that can be a story. If you see a lot of your peers or a lot of your friends tweeting something that's wrong or talking about something, spreading a rumor, like sort of debunking that can be a story. And I know that there are all of these like fact check, Trump said this, and it's like, it's a thing that he like clearly can't do. But I think that in some context, it's helpful to have like it written out, spelled out with all the source and with all the reporting, why something is wrong or why something is false, so that people can refer to it. And then if other people are trying to stop people from spreading that, they have like a credible source to go to. And then as far as Twitter goes, I personally hate tweeting. My Twitter is awful. I haven't, my personal persona is more on Instagram, and I use Twitter sort of to like try to promote my stories. But that for me is something that I sort of like push myself to do, because if you're not going to advocate for someone to read your stories, then who is? So I think that don't feel like you have to be like always on Twitter. Like sometimes you just need to get your work done instead. Sometimes you can be the person who's just retweeting really helpful resources from credible sources or articles that are good. But if you feel comfortable tweeting, then just keep in mind that like potential employers are going to see your tweets, your coworkers, people who are potential sources are going to see your tweets. But just use your best judgment. Know that like Twitter is, I think that if you're a journalist, Twitter is more of a professional space. And then maybe if your Instagram is on private, then you can be a little more fun there. But just do what you feel comfortable with.
So I want to come back to something Quinn mentioned about diversity of sources, as well as something Laura mentioned about how the panel we have today does not really reflect the broader demographics of the journalism profession, right? So first, I think I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and honor the work of some pioneering journalists of color, right? Like Ida B. Wells, Ruben Salazar, Connie Chung, and just so many others. These folks were indeed professional journalists, but they were also sometimes criticized for quote unquote being biased. In terms of regional so-called bias, there have been some conversations here on the West Coast about news media in general being or having an East Coast bias, and maybe the California fires and yesterday's earthquake are not getting the kind of attention that they would have gotten if these natural disasters were happening on the East Coast. So the question from the chat from Jason that I would like to loop into this conversation is, what advice do y'all have as panelists in terms of on the job challenging older journalists in the newsroom on their own implicit biases, whether it's based on their cultural background, their gender, whether it's based on their geographic origin? I mean, all of y'all have a connection to California, which is not the case in many of our newsrooms. How do you ask your more senior colleagues to take these into consideration without stepping on their toes, without coming across as like the snowflake young person, and without jeopardizing your job?
I think that's a great question, because it does get at the professional considerations that you have to make, I think, in any workspace. You know, just in terms of being a nervous new person, as a lot of you will be when you're starting at your first internships or, you know, the first career job that you do get. One of the things that I really work on in working in DC is that you have a lot of editors with tons of political experience, and they've been in this town for a while, and they know how, you know, the institutions here work, and they're very well connected to those institutions, which is to the benefit of all of us at ABC and, you know, every other news organization that relies on people who have been around for a while. But I think one of the things that I really strive to do is reaching outside of the Beltway. And, you know, I know this kind of gets at a classic trope, but it is important for, us to make as many trips to the border as possible. For example, if you're also covering the Department of Homeland Security. The pandemic has stopped that a bit, but just before in February, I was down there in Southern Arizona, and we really pushed for this trip because we needed to document the progress of the border wall. And that is not an easy thing to just show up and do. But anytime we can combine the field work of storytelling from the ground by, yes, getting access from Customs and Border Protection to do that, and combine that with the policy reporting that we do back home and trying to figure out what's coming next from the U.S. government, that is the way that we can shape our stories in a way that I think reflects a certain type of diversity that's important. And I try to encourage all of us to break out of the Beltway when we can.
So I'm actually at a stage in my career where I am a senior reporter. I am one of the most public faces for Politico, and I'm their most senior reporter of color as well, in addition to just being a senior reporter. I covered Congress for many years on Capitol Hill. I saw Arit there a few times. She was a Hill reporter as well. I don't know if she's still going there. I haven't been there as much lately, but I've covered energy and environment policy, congressional campaigns, the House and Senate. Now I'm covering a presidential election. I'm also, in addition to working at Politico, a CNN analyst. So what I would say is that throughout every stage, now I can pretty much speak as freely as I want to, not worry about stepping on anyone's toes, and just tell our editors what I think needs to be covered. But to get to this point, it was difficult, and I tried to balance in terms of where I picked my battles. But I definitely wasn't afraid to push. When I wanted to expand what I covered, I went to the editors and I directly told them, I think, we need to cover climate change, this climate change topic this way. I want to go and cover Congress. Let me go do it. Whatever perspective and whatever lived experience you bring to the newsroom, if it's different than what is there, and it probably will be, because still, again, the vast majority of editors throughout my entire career, from the Hill newspaper to Huffington Post to Politico, I have always had white male editors, and they view, politics from a very institutionalized lens. Politico itself is about, was founded on kind of really gritty access journalism that was very hyper-focused on the Beltway, on what was happening in Washington. It's grown immensely, and part of what I'm doing there now is trying to make sure that we're covering parts of the electorate that they've never considered covering before. Black and brown voters, that we are also hopefully including more voter voices in our stories. So not just politicians, insiders, things of that nature. And one thing that I think that at Politico I try to push back against, and I've even fought it within myself, having covered Congress for so many years, is that when you cover Congress and you're so close and you're rubbing elbows with senators and House members, you start reaching a professional relationship where you can text with them, where you have like these in-depth conversations with them, is to check that institutional biases, which is to think that Congress is the entire world and what is happening there is the only thing that matters. And also to remind yourself what those policies that they're trying to distill down to very basic right and left fights, what impact those policies have on everyday people, and to make sure that your stories hammer that home. If it'll have insane consequential ramifications for people who are struggling, like this coronavirus fight. What ultimately are they trying to pass? What Republicans put forward didn't include actually extra stimulus check, money. So what exactly are they arguing about, and what are the real world ramifications for everyday Americans who are, going paycheck to paycheck right now, who have been evicted from their homes? So if you ever have the privilege of covering Congress and being there, I recommend it. It's a wonderful experience, and it definitely makes you a sharper reporter, but you do have to check those institutional biases.
I want to focus a little bit on sort of the office politics. I mean, I personally am kind of like a little bit of a shy person, so it's hard for me to sort of like be confrontational. And so the thing that I've learned to do is, one, just make sure that my ideas are rock solid, and two, find the people at whatever job you have, or even in your like own newsroom, find the people there who are going to root for you, who are going to like believe in your ideas, and who are going to help you figure out how to talk to the editor who doesn't take you seriously, or talk to the editor who doesn't agree, who doesn't think that your story idea is worth pursuing, or that it's not worth the time. Because every job I've had, I have had at least one person who even the fact that I cover politics at all is because there was a younger female editor at my first job at The Atlantic who wanted more women of color covering politics. So I was a fellow, basically like a glorified intern. I was writing these blog posts on entertainment and stuff. And she was like, hey, this Obamacare website came out, like, why don't you do a blog post on this? And she would send me articles, and I would sort of get the hang of it. And then I'd start pitching her ideas. And she really worked with me on just how to become a political reporter. And honestly, without her, like, I don't even know where I'd be or what I'd be doing. And I've never had that luck again, where I just had someone who was like so invested in my success that they literally just held my hand the whole way through. But I have had places where maybe my direct editor wasn't that person, but there was another editor there who I could talk to. And I will say that at the LA Times, I've been really lucky to have an editor, a woman of color editor, who has actually been very supportive and really just pushing. Like, when I pitch ideas, she talks through them with me. But sometimes you won't have that. Sometimes you'll have editors who are dismissive. And to just wrap it up, the two things I would say are trust your ideas, but also make sure that your ideas are solid. They always say, don't come with a story theme like, I want to write about coronavirus. Like, that's a dream. That's not a story idea. Say, I want to cover this one store in my community that had to shut down, and how that store was open, and why they picked that community, and how they're trying to rebuild, and how their failure shows the broader theme of how coronavirus is impacting the economy. That's a story. And if your editor doesn't want to do that, talk to another editor or another senior reporter or someone else who you think will like the story idea. Talk to them about how you can build on that story idea, and then go back to your editor again. And if they don't like that story, go back to them again. Because the one thing is, even if you're not naturally an aggressive person or a confrontational person, you have to be a persistent person, and you have to keep pushing, because eventually they're going to start taking you seriously. And eventually you're going to get the stories you want out there. And that's how you build on that. And then next time you come to them with a story idea, they'll be like, okay.
So Arit, I think that's really great advice. And I'm going to tie together some questions that we're seeing in the chat, because you talked about how people, younger reporters, can be tough on the job, sometimes with editors who are dismissive, or more senior folks who aren't taking your suggestions seriously. So I'm wondering, what tips in general would our panelists give students for developing a tough skin as they embark on a journalism career? We heard from our keynote that journalism is a tough profession. And then there's also a question in the chat from Brianna about being a person of color. Have you ever encountered situations where your credibility or your skill or your competence was being questioned because of your background? And if so, how did you handle that? So it feeds into the whole kind of being tough and being resilient.
I think sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, it's okay. I just talk. Go ahead, please.
I would just say don't take anything personal. I think when we're dealing with like your background and your culture, a lot of the times the people that you're working with maybe are a little bit, I don't want to say ignorant, but just oblivious to why you have this certain connection or why you're pitching this story. So you have to kind of understand where they're coming from too and think like it's not personal, and just have solid like bulletproof ideas. And I think like at the core, like if your story is good, regardless of the race or the gender or religious or anything that that person or that story has, like if your story is good, it's going to be good. So sometimes you just can't take anything personal, right? And sometimes people just have different ideas, and your editor may have grown up in a different time or have different beliefs, and they just have different ideas. It doesn't mean that your idea is bad. You can pitch the same exact idea to somebody else and they might like it, you know? So sometimes it's not about that. You can't take anything personal. Your idea, if it's solid, if you have a good story, you have a good story. Maybe you're just not pitching it to the right person, and that's not that's not your fault at the end of the day.
I would, yes, I mean, you have to have a tough skin. Even at my level, I still encounter difficulties with editors and with higher ups, and it's exhausting, especially given the pace of the news cycle right now, which is that I haven't had a weekend off. I mean, I can't remember the last time I had a weekend off, and I probably won't have one until well after the election. But I would say, kind of picking up on something Arit said earlier, it is important to find allies in the newsroom, whether it's your colleagues, maybe someone who isn't directly above you, but has a little bit more experience. If you can find a mentor that way, if they, that can help. Also, it's really key to try to, if you can, and it isn't always the easiest, find an editor who wants to help you become better, whether it's your writing or whether it's, the way you approach sources and the way you look at stories, and someone who listens to you. And if you are encountering trouble with your direct editor listening to you, I would try to find as many allies as you can in the newsroom to express different areas that need to be covered that maybe your newsroom hasn't covered before. Right now, a lot of newsrooms are undergoing changes, big changes. Ones that were spurred a lot in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing, and a recognition that these newsrooms are not as diverse as they should be, and that it hasn't been a priority to diversify them in the past. Politico is having conversations amongst, the reporters of color that there are there right now about how do we change this newsroom and how do we make it the best that it can be in terms of what we're covering. So having those other reporters, that whether you're a person of color or not, but you want to change the way the newsroom approaches certain stories, having those other reporters that you can turn to helps a lot when you're trying to present to editors or to your editor-in-chief that certain things should change and need to change. And then I don't remember your second question, Bailing. I'm sorry about.
That's okay, because we're almost out of time, and I am going to give all of y'all to offer one last piece of advice. We have a lot of students on the call. We're still at almost 100. And some folks may not be a journalism major, they may be other majors, and really no matter what you study, you can go into journalism or be a responsible consumer of news. So in your closing comment for our panel today, I would like you to tell us what is, in your opinion, one of the best reasons to go into journalism as a profession?
I've got to say if I could just, it's kind of a softball question for me, because I think the best way to think about going into journalism is to think of it as a public service. And especially if you're just starting out, you got to work for the local paper, your local NPR station. Think about how you're just talking about what's going on in the community. I really, it's really easy to think like, oh, I have to get to DC to be a good journalist, or I've got to get to New York. That's where all the networks are headquartered. But if you're just looking to build the basic skills, you can do that right at home. And I really think that is the best way to kind of, establish yourself credibly, but also just to learn like the function of, how does your community work? Like how do the levers of power work where you are? Because those same levers replicate themselves all over the place. And anyway, that's might not be something entirely mind blowing to a lot of you, but really journalism is a public service, and you should, think of it as that and approach it with that. And even if you're thinking about going into one of those other professions, I think it does start with journalism. I think everyone needs to, start with being, focusing on where the stories are that matter, how to tell those stories, how to contribute to the conversation. And I think for me as someone who started with KPBS and NPR, I have to say that like the donations that support a place like that are really important, because influences come from all over the place, and this anytime a community is democratically lifting up a news organization, I think that is the best way to like to reduce harm for that organization, or reduce at least improper influences.
Thank you. Someone else?
I would just say it's really fun. I mean, what other job do you get to just talk to strangers, like just call people out of the blue and say, please talk to me about the thing that you are most passionate about in the world for 20 or 30 minutes, and then do that over and over. Sometimes you get to travel, you get to explore different areas, even in your own community, talk to people you never get to talk to. And then honestly, reporting is fun, writing is the hard part, but then you can actually see like the effect of your story. I mean, maybe if it's a big investigative piece, you're changing policy. If it's like a service journalism piece, you're helping people figure out like how to do everyday tasks that they're trying to figure out. If it's like a political story, like I did a story that was basically, these are the ballot rules and the mail deadlines in the swing states, and this will help give us an idea of when we'll know who won the election. And I mean, and that I think is a useful piece, just because it sort of speaks to the anxiety people have about, are we going to know who the president is on the night of November 3rd? So I think that it's a fun job where you get to explore a lot of different ideas, and you get to do something useful for your community. And yeah, I mean, there are harder ways to make a living.
Thank you.
And I would totally just piggyback off of that. It is super fun. It is unlike any job, I would say. And I know people are like, oh, you're always out in the field. I sometimes spend days, in the office, but it's not like tedious work. I'm making calls, I'm talking to random people. And it's so interesting to find out about, community members that you didn't even know that are having such a huge impact, even at the local level. And then also just like, where else could you even, do this? You can't, as an accountant, you can't do that. Or, like it's one of those majors where you can't get this anywhere else. And it is also public service. Sometimes I'll do stories on, resources for the community, or like if you're struggling with eviction, where can you get rental assistance, and I'll get callers and say like, hey, like I was really going through, this issue, your article helped me, or like I was able to get, some financial aid, and like, that makes it all worth it. And I don't think you can get that kind of satisfaction of knowing like you really made a difference, or you really helped out the local community in any other job. So for me, that's what it is. When I get those calls saying like, hey, that actually helped me out, like that makes everything worth it.
So I wasn't a journalism major. I was a political science major at Cal State Fullerton, but I did write for the Daily Titan, and I edited for it as well. So yeah, you don't need a journalism major to go into this profession. I think that everything everyone said about it being fun is accurate. It's definitely an adrenaline rush almost every single day. And no 2 days are the same. I write about wide, range of topics. But why I got into this field and why I think it's important for others to get into this field is that it is extremely vital to the core foundation of this country. And I think that there is a desperate need for more reporters, more local reporters, more diverse reporters across the spectrum in every newsroom in this country. And I got into this because I wanted to help educate and inform the American public about issues that were going unnoticed, about injustices that were going unchecked, about stories that they maybe hadn't heard before or weren't paying attention to. And so in ways that I've done that more recently, yes, it's focusing on, Black and brown voters in swing states who for so long have not been written about. What are their concerns for this election cycle? What are they worried about? And I think that if you go into it with that purpose and with that drive to inform the public and make them confront things that sometimes they would rather just ignore, that could really help, this country and also make the profession that much better.
So I want to say thank you to everyone who submitted questions for our panelists. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. I'd also, of course, like to say thank you to our amazing panelists for participating today in our symposium. I know that all of y'all have super important, stressful jobs, and your being here today to just share your perspectives and share your advice with our students is so, so valuable. And to summarize your last pieces of advice, I have this for our student journalists and our other students about why people should really consider a journalism career. It's about exploring ideas. You can have fun, educate people, help your community, make a difference, serve the public, change the world. And last, I would say the journalism profession is also one of the best ways to live the First Amendment and our commitment to our democratic society. So at this time, I'm going to close our formal program and thank everyone again for joining us. So y'all should have received a second Zoom link that was sent to you this morning at about 9:45. So if you want to jump off of this call and go into the other Zoom link, what we'll do there is a series of breakout networking sessions hosted by our event manager, Associate Dean, Dr. Deanna Leone. So I'm going to be jumping over there and I'll see all of y'all in a little bit. And thank you again so much.